I'm very happy about this event today. I'm not very happy about the weather, I should add, because we had hoped to have a bigger audience, and probably this combination of nice weather during the day and rain exactly when the lecture was supposed to start doesn't really help us. Still, having said that, I'm very happy that we have our guest speaker here, Professor Patrick Salmon, who will be introduced to you in a second. I would just like to say a few words about the faculty before we get started, and the university more generally. Probably the guests, the people who are here for the first time, have noticed that Maastricht as a city has a long history, that also the building actually goes back to the 18th century, and also this room, this building that we're in at the moment, has a quite interesting history called Turnsaal. It was built for physical exercises in the 19th century, and it was the first of its kind in all of the Netherlands. So you have quite a bit of history on the premises here. Having said that, the university and also the faculty are quite young, still in their late 30s basically. It is the most international in the university in this country, and I think also students as well as faculty members represent this international mix quite well. There are rather few people here in this room, unfortunately, today, but also these people do represent the variety of backgrounds that Maastricht University stands for. Obviously, Maastricht University today is very much identified with the treaty 30 years ago, the Maastricht Treaty, and indeed these days we do have this at this faculty, at this university, have quite a few programs that are about European dimensions of European politics, European law, even health, beyond the premises of this faculty. In this faculty itself, of course, huge European studies program, both at the bachelor and the master's levels, and also students in arts and culture programs deal quite a bit with questions that have to do with Europe. And therefore, I think it is very important for us to expand and extend our knowledge into new fields of European research, particularly in those areas where historians normally tend to stop with their research, some in the 1970s or early 1980s, and where political scientists often say, well, this is too long ago, we don't deal with these things anymore. So particularly when it comes to these kind of issues, we're particularly happy to have somebody who speaks to us on European matters. Moreover, we have an ever larger group and portion of students from the United Kingdom, which probably reflects educational policies on both sides of the channel. And given, of course, the important role that the United Kingdom has played in all periods of European history and also European integration history, we're always particularly happy if we have somebody who can enlighten us on the role that the United Kingdom has played in European matters. And this is particularly true, of course, now, and with a presentation about Margaret Thatcher and her contribution to European and global politics, when her name is so big in the press again, and when also her legacy has been discussed so much in public again in the United Kingdom and beyond. And I think it would be very difficult to find a more distinguished speaker for these kind of issues than Professor Patrick Salmon, who is with us today. And I don't want to introduce him to you now, but rather I want to give the word to Martin Farr from the British Scholar Society. We'll first say a few words about the society itself, and then also introduce the speaker proper. We'll then have the presentation to be followed by Q&A, and hopefully many more people to join us while we start with this lecture. Again, welcome. Thanks so much again for being with us here today. And I look forward to an exciting lecture and hopefully also stimulating discussion.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you all for coming in such dreadful conditions, with which we're very familiar, of course, coming from the UK. My name's Martin Farr. I'm a lecturer at Newcastle University, where the rain is even colder than it is here. And I've come down because I'm involved with the British Scholar Society. As you can see, this is our website. And we have a journal which is published by Edinburgh University Press, an academic peer-reviewed journal, and a book series. And the purpose of the society is to deal with Britain's interactions with the world since the 17th century. And it's based on the belief, certainly in the US, that British history really has a future only when it thinks about itself in the widest possible context, rather than internally, about Britain's interactions with the world. Not merely British imperialism, but all manner of ways in which Britain has influenced and been influenced by the world at large. So the book series and the journal, a conference which we held in Austin, Texas last year, and which will be in Newcastle next year, 19th to 21st of June 2014 will be our next conference at Newcastle University. So hope very much you can come along and sign up to the website and to the newsletter and to the things that we post, which are all intended to cultivate interest in the subject and to provide a network for historians of all stages in their careers. My other reason for coming is that as Director of Outreach, my concern is to promote the Society and to have what we call the Global Britain Lecture. And this is the latest Global Britain Lecture, which is based on, we had one in Berlin last year with Hugh Strawn speaking about the First World War. This is Patrick Salmon speaking about Margaret Thatcher. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Patrick because Patrick was the professor at Newcastle University who chose to hire me 12 years ago now as a lecturer. And he stayed at Newcastle from 1980 until 2005 when he left to become the chief historian at the Foreign Office. So after a career of writing and researching diplomatic history, he became appointed the chief historian at the Foreign Office. And it isn't unfair to say the chief historian in the British political system because only the Foreign Office has a professional historical section. Patrick is in charge of that and he's overseen the release of papers and all sorts of scholarly work based upon Britain's foreign relations. And that's the reason why we've asked him to come and speak to you today about Margaret Thatcher and her role in the world. And I'll hand over now with great pleasure to Patrick Salmon.
Well, thank you, Kieran, and thank you, Martin, for those very kind words of introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here at the University of Maastricht, my very first visit, and I'm, of course, pleased that the weather is as miserable here as it is back home. Just before I start, you'll notice the rather important caveat on that screen, which says, the views expressed in this lecture are those of the speaker and do not reflect those of the British government. That is a really important thing. I do not want to be taken as any sort of spokesperson for any government body of any kind. The Foreign Office is the sort of organisation that allows me to come and speak and say my own thoughts at these sorts of occasions, so I'm grateful to that, but that's as far as it goes. Well, Margaret Thatcher, Europe and the world. Where should we start? Well, I'll start, I think, a long, long time ago. I never met Margaret Thatcher, but I did see her once. It was actually back in 1971 or 1972 when she was Education Secretary in Edward Heath's government. And she was visiting the agricultural college where my father taught and where we lived. And I remember that my mother and I dashed to the attic, the only place where we could get a view of the farmyard, and there we saw Mrs. Thatcher, clad in coat and hat. She was very formally dressed in those days, both blue, I think, as they usually were, slightly stooped and stalking very purposefully forward, her head slightly cocked as if looking out for danger, and perhaps she was looking out for dangerous cows or sheep, or she may have been looking out for journalists, because it was just after that time, when she'd got into really big trouble with the media about the idea that she was stealing milk from school children. Remember that story? It was an economy forced on her, actually, as Education Secretary, and it's an experience she never forgot and learnt from. Well, I was reminded of that vision of Mrs. Thatcher scurrying across the farmyard when I read the first page of Charles Moore's outstanding, I think, new biography, authorised biography of Margaret Thatcher, where he quotes the novelist Alan Hollinghurst, a very good novel called The Line of Beauty, which I recommend actually as a better introduction to the Thatcher years than most history books. And what Hollinghurst described as her gracious scuttle, her hurrying gait as she moved from meeting to meeting. And Charles Moore says, you could see that hers was a life with no space for self-examination. An overpowering work ethic drove Margaret Roberts, later Margaret Thatcher, from one task to the next. She was extremely well prepared on every subject. She'd learnt that habit as a schoolgirl, as an Oxford undergraduate, and as a trainee lawyer, but she hardly ever sat down to reflect upon the past, Charles Moore says, either her own past or that of Great Britain, strangely enough, except in a highly simplified sense. If she did think about the past, it was more in the nature of myth-making, to explain to herself and to others the trajectory of her own career and of her country's history as she understood it. The myth, for instance, of Alderman Roberts, her father, whose saintly characteristics were more evident when she achieved political prominence than in her youth. when she often chafed at the constraints of an austere and excessively pious household. And actually Charles Moore's biography is extremely good because it uses for the first time letters she wrote to her sister Muriel, and they really got fed up with their parents a lot of the time, which is rather nice to see. Or the myths of Britain standing alone in 1940 and Winston Churchill. These are, of course, true myths in a sense. Winston Churchill, whom she did actually meet once, but with whom she was never on first-name terms. Winston, she used to refer to him, of course, later in life. She had a small number of beliefs, mostly acquired very early and held very intensely, which hardly changed. In fact, her programme in 1979 was also almost identical to the views she was propounding back in the late 1940s when she was a prospective parliamentary candidate, or when she entered Parliament for the first time as member for Finchley in 1959. Some details, of course, changed. She dropped imperial preference. That wasn't really a thing you were going to bother with by the 1970s, and indeed she was not all that keen on the multiracial Commonwealth as it emerged from the 50s onwards. But she never lost, first of all, her determination to restore British greatness, and there was no change in her mission to confront and ultimately defeat the challenge of Soviet communism. Now, in pushing forward such ideas, she had a preference for confrontation over compromise, as we all know, and for argument over discussion. She did admire intellectuals, but she wasn't a systematic thinker herself. And she didn't really like debate in one key area, and that was in cabinet. She very much preferred to state her views at the outset, virtually daring her colleagues, all male colleagues, of course, with one small exception. Good test, actually, who was the one woman who served in Mrs. Thatcher's government. It was Lady Young as Lord Privy Seal between 1982 and 1983, virtually daring her male colleagues to disagree with her. She was actually much nicer to people in lowlier positions than higher ones, and it did help a lot if you knew your facts and held your ground. Again, junior officials were often treated very well, in contrast to senior ones, who she tended to bully. And it also helped if you had charm, preferably of an old-fashioned kind. She liked handsome men, well-dressed men. The best example in British domestic politics was Cecil Parkinson, who many will remember as a chairman of the Conservative Party in the 80s. It was best of all, of course, if you had charm and intellect, like Helmut Schmidt, for example, Mikhail Gorbachev, François Mitterrand, but definitely not Helmut Kohl. Now, charm raises the question of sex, which we're going to address here, and then I won't anymore. I will stop. But I think it needs to be thought about, because being a woman, first of all, was crucial in her rise in British politics, especially in Conservative politics. For a very simple reason, there were no other women around in Conservative politics throughout the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. No women, that is, who really matched her at all in ability and prominence. And there is no doubt at all that she used her femininity and to many her sex appeal, many men did find her sexy, as a weapon to charm but also intimidate male colleagues, many held back by simple gallantry from fighting as toughly with her as she did with them. Now, of course, all this made her very difficult to work with, whether you're a cabinet colleague or senior civil servant, perhaps used to decades of cross-party consensus on all sorts of issues, such as the need for an incomes policy, or to avoid confrontation with the trade unions, or to seek coexistence with the Soviet Union. And it was just as disconcerting if you're a foreign statesman used to dealing with British politicians who seemed by the 1970s to have become resigned to an ignominious position in world affairs. Now, a foreign policy which is conducted by confrontation and argument, with a strong sense of mission in some areas, but a large measure of indifference or ignorance in others, with a disconcerting habit of not sticking to the accepted convention of diplomacy, did not make for an easy life. And it's the difficulties of that diplomatic life which I'll be talking about really in this lecture. But it does also make life difficult for the historian in trying to assess the significance of what Thatcher achieved, as opposed to a mere description of a career crowded with events. As an official historian, publishing collections of documents on the foreign policy of the 1980s, I've been privileged to read a great many diplomatic documents, and I've also been allowed to see the official papers of Mrs. Thatcher herself. That really is a privilege. And what you quickly learn is the way in which she would annotate everything. First of all, she read everything, and secondly, she marked the papers she read, sometimes with comment, and the comments, if you could read them, are sometimes very interesting, often very violent, but also the underlining. That was very typical. She would underline things of importance, single underlining, fairly important, double underlining, very important, wiggly lines. She strongly disagreed with what was being written in that paper. And you, as I say, you quickly get the feel for her approach to foreign policy. In addition to publishing documents, I've also talked to many of the people who worked with her during that era. Now, in a lecture planned long before her recent death and the simultaneous appearance of 2 new biographies, both with the same title actually, Not for Turning, a joke she didn't understand but nevertheless made famous, one of them actually rather good in a sort of gossipy way, Robin Harris. The other one, as I've said, simply outstanding, I think, Charles Moore. I can't hope to have the last word on the subject of Lady Thatcher, and I won't attempt a complete survey of her foreign policy career. What I'll do, if I may, is focus on just a few episodes to illustrate how she operated and what contributed to her success or lack of success in these cases, and then I'll undertake the more difficult task of trying to assess what it all added up to. First, though, a few general remarks on Margaret Thatcher and British foreign policy. I'm going to have a very good foreign secretary, and I shan't go on any foreign trips at all. My job is to turn the economy round. This is what Mrs. Thatcher said to the Cabinet Secretary, Sir John Hunt, shortly before the election of 1979. Now, much has been made of Mrs. Thatcher's lack of interest or experience in foreign affairs when she became Prime Minister. Well, this, I think, is first of all a cliché, and secondly, untrue. Of course, she had no direct ministerial experience of foreign affairs. It's also true that her main focus in the years between 1979 and 1982 was on revolutionising the British economy and dealing with the fallout from that revolution in the form of high unemployment and industrial confrontation. But her biographer, John Campbell, is right when he remarks that from the moment she first became interested in politics, she was always more stirred by foreign and military affairs than domestic matters. And she did have more experience than one might think. She'd visited several countries, such as Israel, Sweden, the United States, and the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and that she made numerous foreign visits during her time as leader of the opposition between 1975 and 1979. She went to the United States twice, in 1975 and again in 1977, where she, among other things, forged a close friendship with Governor Ronald Reagan of California. In 1977, she also visited West Germany, where she addressed the Christian Democrat Congress in Hanover. She also went to Romania, Yugoslavia, China, India, Pakistan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. So she was well-travelled. And although we often think of the intellectual circle of people who influenced her domestic policy, led above all by Sir Keith Joseph, but also Alfred Sherman and other acolytes of the right, the Soviet expert Robert Conquest was just as much her guru in international affairs as Sir Keith Joseph was in domestic. He wrote the first of her 2 big speeches on foreign affairs in which she castigated the Soviet Union, although he didn't write the second one, the one which earned her the title of Iron Lady, which she delighted in ever after. And when she became Prime Minister, she did not, of course, leave it all to her Foreign Secretary, as she said she would. What sorts of relationship did she have with her 5 Foreign Secretaries? Lord Carrington, Francis Pym, Geoffrey Howe, John Major, and Douglas Hurd. Well, if they were confident, assertive, positive, optimistic, they could hold their own. If not, she bullied them. Carrington and Hurd were the most successful in this respect, Francis Pym the least. John Major, who held the job for barely 3 months in 1989, was hardly there long enough, but even so there was time for one big row between Major and Thatcher, which I shall come back to later. Geoffrey Howe with whom she'd had an ambivalent relationship long before they came into office, was definitely in the bullied category, though his term as Foreign Secretary was much the longest and with some of the biggest problems, but also some of the biggest successes of her premiership. Well, what about then her relationship with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office? One dark evening, writes Charles Moore, she was standing at the door of number 10, staring up at the bulk of the Foreign Office opposite. "Look at that," she said to an official, "the place that keeps the light out of Downing Street." Well, that was her view, allegedly. And of course, she made much of her distrust of the Foreign Office and its diplomats. Yet George Walden, who was himself a diplomat before becoming a Conservative MP, says in his memoirs that this was, and I quote, "largely myth." In reality, she relied on them for advice, admired their professionalism, and would be damned if she ever said so. And I think there was a lot in that. Well, with those thoughts in mind, let's turn to 3 case studies that I would like to go into in a little bit more depth. One, I would suggest an unambiguous success, one an ambiguous success, and one an outright failure. Well, I think the first one, the unambiguous success, was her relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev. She came to office with her reputation as the Iron Lady firmly established. Charles Moore writes that Mrs. Thatcher was determined to challenge Moscow from the start of her premiership, and she certainly did. But she was also quite pragmatic. She supported a boycott of the Moscow Olympics over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan at the end of December 1979, but she resisted American demands to block construction of the Siberian gas pipeline over the imposition of martial law in Poland in December 1981. And she later proved remarkably open-minded and receptive to the possibility of a new reformist leader emerging from the Soviet hierarchy after the deaths in quick succession of Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernenko. Although several people have claimed credit for identifying Gorbachev as the coming man in Soviet politics, I think it's one of the rare examples where one can quantify the influence of intelligence on foreign policy. As we all know now, but very few people knew then, the deputy chief of the KGB's London station, Oleg Gordievsky, had been working secretly from the British for some years. As various names are bandied about, the Soviet political sociologist Fyodor Berlatsky toured various universities in Britain and the United States in 1984, telling those Sovietologists who would listen that a new leader was on the way who would transform the Soviet Union and East-West relations. One of those experts, Jonathan Haslam, who tells that story, admits that he was not one of them. He didn't believe the John the Baptist figure proclaiming the new leader. But he does admit that Berlatsky and other information coming out of the Soviet Union was taken seriously in government because Gordievsky supported that information, supported that view. The name, of course, being bandied about was Mikhail Gorbachev, and head of the Foreign Office's Eastern European Department engineered a visit to the UK by Gorbachev as head of a parliamentary delegation in December 1984. Well, that was fine, of course. You could identify Gorbachev, but much still depended on the personal chemistry between the two leaders, or the prospective Soviet leader. And it would not have worked at all if there had not been a meeting of minds between Thatcher and Gorbachev. They were both true believers, of course, in their respective systems, but they were both intellectually alert and enjoyed an argument. It was after this first meeting that Thatcher famously declared that he was a man with whom she could do business. And she soon became a vital intermediary with Ronald Reagan at a time when the American president was still intensely suspicious of anything emerging from what he famously described as the evil empire. But as always with Thatcher, there's more than one aspect to the question. She always remained suspicious of Soviet military capacity, and even worse, of the possibility that the superpowers might do a deal over the heads of their allies and dispense with nuclear weapons altogether, as Reagan and Gorbachev threatened to do at the Reykjavik summit in October 1986. And with all her admiration for Gorbachev, she couldn't quite see that success for him would actually have meant a rejuvenation of the Soviet system, not its end. She was unwilling to see him as other more hard-headed people did, notably in the Bush administration, but also in the British Foreign Office, as an essentially transitional figure. They felt he wouldn't survive long, so that it was best to seize the opportunities he'd created before someone else, much less congenial, came along. But support for Gorbachev was consistent with Thatcher's unequivocal support for change throughout the Soviet bloc, reflected, for example, in her highly successful visit to Poland in 1988, and also for the Know-How Fund, established in 1989 after Solidarity's success in the Polish elections and later extended to the entire Soviet sphere, including post-Soviet sphere, including Russia itself. Well, that was my example of something that worked really well on almost all levels. What about one that's a bit more ambiguous? My example here is South Africa. Thatcher was actually instinctively sympathetic to the position of the whites in Rhodesia and South Africa, and her sympathies were reinforced by her husband Dennis Thatcher, who had very strong personal and business connections in southern Africa, and believe me, was not the sort of person who was terribly sympathetic towards the aspirations of the black population. She was also sceptical of Foreign Office advice, usually, on southern Africa, though she accepted it over Lancaster House, the agreement that secured the independence of Zimbabwe in 1979. She preferred to listen to people such as Lawrence van der Post, the famous South African mystic, or Chief Buthelezi, the Zulu leader, who reinforced her hostility to the African National Congress. But she was definitely opposed to apartheid. In 1984, in some papers that I've recently been reading, I found an appeal from the Kwangema community about their forced removal from their ancestral lands under the apartheid system. Charles Pole, who'd just become her Secretary for Foreign Affairs, passed it to her with a handwritten comment that it was a heartbreaking letter. And she wrote in return, "Charles, we cannot just leave this alone. I must write to the PM." In other words, write to Prime Minister P.W. Botha. And she did write a very forceful letter. That didn't mean, however, that she had much or even any sympathy for the ANC at that time. And she was scornful of much of what the anti-apartheid movement stood for, whether at home or in America, the Commonwealth or the EU. She persistently and consistently saw the ANC as a terrorist organisation. And of course, terrorism meant a lot to Thatcher, in that two of her closest advisors, Erin Neve and Ian Gow, were blown up by the IRA, and she also was nearly killed, along with many of her colleagues, in the Brighton bombing of 1984. She was also, of course, hostile to communism, and the ANC was very close to the Communist Party at that time, and scornful of economic sanctions. Those views might have been acceptable, perhaps, if it weren't for the way in which she expressed them. And here she was really at her worst in seeking to score points and needlessly gain an advantage over her opponents in argument. She delighted in belittling the outcome of the Bermuda Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 1985. This was the point where, in the press conference, she said, "We just give them that little bit away." You know, it's really annoying to those people who'd fought for several days to reach a deal. 2 years later, at a later Commonwealth meeting in Vancouver, she denounced the ANC as a terrorist organisation, and 2 years after that, at Kuala Lumpur, at yet another Commonwealth meeting, she went out of her way to distance herself from not only the Commonwealth, but also the Foreign Office, ordering Charles Pole to draft a new statement on sanctions without the knowledge of the new Foreign Secretary, John Major, something he found absolutely infuriating. Well, Thatcher was perhaps right to expose the hypocrisy of many of those who called for sanctions, and it was also understandable that she should seek to encourage the internal reforms that did take place in South Africa, especially after the election of F.W. de Klerk as state president in 1989. But until that point, it seemed a very tenuous argument to rely on the reforming zeal of President Botha. And of course, sanctions ultimately did work, not perhaps the token sanctions adopted by the Commonwealth and the EU, but above all, the actions of American banks in refusing to roll over short-term loans to South Africa. David Owen, who had a very good record on apartheid as Foreign Secretary in the 70s, makes this point very clearly. A myth was propagated by Margaret Thatcher, who said that sanctions never had any effect on the changes that came in 1990 with President de Klerk. That was never the view of the South African business community. Well, what about the argument that she achieved more by talking privately to the regime than sanctions ever did? It is true that she did speak bluntly to President Botha in their lengthy private correspondence. I've quoted one example, but there's another one here where after the South African raid on Gaborone in neighbouring Botswana in 1985, she wrote, "What would the international community think if Britain retaliated by launching attacks across the border into the Irish Republic, where many of the terrorists are?" Actually, that letter, unusually, was drafted by the Foreign Office, and very unusually, it was not torn to pieces and rewritten by Charles Pole. So for once, the Foreign Office was saying something with Charles Pole and Thatcher both agreed. And that sort of tough language did work. P.W. Botha was duly chastened, wrote a fairly polite reply, and Charles Pole wrote on his letter, "I interpret this as a considerable climb down." So there was this ding-dong battle going on throughout the mid-80s between Thatcher and Botha, in which each gave way a little bit, each made a little bit of progress. What about the role of the Foreign Office in South African policy? Well, in fact, the more one looks at it, the more, this is the bit where I say this is not government policy, I'm not expressing the views of the British government. The views of the Foreign Office were not that different from Thatcher's, I think, is the bottom line. They both wanted to give the impression of movement without actually doing very much on sanctions. And in fact, neither Thatcher nor the Foreign Office was making much headway by 1987. In that year, the situation did improve when Robin Rennick was appointed ambassador. He was a good friend of Charles Pole, and he did have the confidence of the Prime Minister. But ultimately, much more decisive was the election of F.W. de Klerk as president in 1989. It was his conviction that apartheid had no future that drove the reform process. And in a way, de Klerk was a more radical figure than Gorbachev, because he realised the system was completely broken, whereas Gorbachev somehow hoped to save communism. Well, my last example of a completely unambiguous failure is the one that will be familiar to many of you, and that is German unification. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the subsequent move towards German unity should have been something to welcome. This was the culmination of all Thatcher's efforts to break down Cold War barriers and defeat communism. But it came very late in her premiership. By this time, noted one official who'd been to Africa with her 10 years before, from being combative and opinionated, but fresh, open and approachable, she'd gone to being tired, closed and cut off from outside advice. And she was cut off especially by Charles Pole, who by this time had achieved a position of dominance as her personal advisor, and by Bernard Ingham, her press officer, who manipulated the press in the directions that he above all wished, which wasn't always quite the same as what she wanted. But that's only part of the problem. There's a much bigger problem, and that is basically that Thatcher disliked Germans. Not all Germans. She admired Dr. Erhard, for instance, the architect of West Germany's economic miracle, and made a point of visiting him when she was leader of the opposition. She did get on well with Helmut Schmidt, who was both clever and good-looking, but she especially disliked and underestimated Helmut Kohl, whom she dismissed when she first met him in 1975 as, and I quote, the German equivalent of Ted Heath, which she didn't have much time for, and whom she patronised for his provincial German taste, especially in food. Well, you can be patronising about German food if you like, but on the long run it doesn't get you very far. You just accept these things, everybody does, you know, but she wasn't prepared to do that. I don't think British food, of the sort that she produced, was much good either. It was mostly tinned peaches. Now, there was some reason for her hostility towards Kohl, because he did treat her quite badly in EU debates in the 1980s. But there was much more than EU spats behind Mrs. Thatcher's attitude to Germany. At a lunch in Downing Street in December 1989, this is, remember, precisely in the middle of the unification process, only a couple of weeks after Kohl's 10-point plan, she had George Urban to lunch. George Urban was one of these Cold Warrior types with whom she was quite close until he broke with her later. He wrote afterwards in his diary, these words. "You know, George," she said, coming quite close to me, "there are things that people of your generation and mine ought never to forget. We've been through the war, and we know perfectly well what the Germans are like and what dictators can do, and our national character doesn't basically change." And that was her ultimate deep conviction. More rationally, she feared the creation of a large German state and believed that it would dominate Europe, despite Kohl's protestations to the contrary. Others, of course, including Mitterrand and Gorbachev, had similar fears, but only she expressed them openly and continued to do so when they shifted tactically to accept the inevitable. But she didn't do much to put those views into effect. Really, she had enough sense to realise that there was nothing she could do. But she didn't allow Britain to develop constructive policy either. So for about 3 months between the beginning of November 1989 and the middle of February 1990, British policy was really paralysed on Germany. And during that time, German events, the disintegration of the GDR, of course, accelerated, and all other leading powers adjusted their positions accordingly. Above all, the Americans backing the Germans, but also France and Russia. Britain was left behind. Now, British diplomacy was finally unleashed after the 2+4 decision at Ottawa in February 1990. And then the 2+4 negotiations showed the FCO at its best, with its unrivaled legal expertise on the German question and its ingenuity in devising constructive solutions to complex problems. But all this came very late. The image of Britain as the most reluctant and the least effective of the four occupying powers was now firmly imprinted, especially on German minds. And it was reinforced by Thatcher herself in a series of outspoken interviews, by the leak of the Chequers meeting, the famous meeting with the historians, the resignation of her closest cabinet ally, Nicholas Ridley, after his incautious remarks in a Spectator interview. Now, I've taken those three examples. Is there anything they have in common? Well, I think perhaps yes. I think in each case the quality of advice was crucial. She succeeded when she listened to advice, and she failed when she refused to listen. This, of course, was her habit. She resisted advice till the last minute, and then, in George Walden's words, went quietly along with pretty well every recommendation. Over Zimbabwe, over Hong Kong, over the Falklands leaseback, well, that wasn't a very good recommendation perhaps, over the Single European Act, over the ERM. And she usually then bit her tongue. She usually didn't then complain about the decision that had been made. Germany was the only big exception. She did, of course, give way and accepted the inevitable, but she was jolly well not going to say so. Quite the opposite. She was going to talk and express her views, however damaging the effect. Well, I've thought of several examples of where she took advice. Are there any examples of her refusing advice and still being successful? I think there is one big one, and that is the European rebate, where her confrontational tactics were very much not to the taste of the Foreign Office, but I think contributed decisively to the successful outcome. Though even here, there was very hard bargaining behind the scenes, and even here too, the rather despised Geoffrey Howe achieved a great deal through his very close personal relationship with the French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas. So I suppose in looking at these three cases, I'm trying to make a case for the importance of the Foreign Office. That is true, but what I'm really showing is the importance of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Office working together. Their professional expertise on the one hand, and on the other her personality and political instincts are overcoming their professional caution. I suppose the Foreign Office just wished they didn't have to fight quite so hard with Mrs. Thatcher on quite so many issues, large and small. Well, those are my three examples, as it were, of Thatcher in action. What I'm going to try to do now is sum up, at some length I have to admit, and try to assess Thatcher's historical legacy. I suppose there are three possibilities here. She changed things for the better, she changed things for the worse, or nothing much changed between 1979 and 1990. And of course there are lots of ways in which those possibilities combine. Some things changed for the better, some for the worse, others didn't change much at all. But all of them assign primary responsibility to Thatcher herself, and I think it's worth stopping to think about that just for a minute. That's quite unusual in a British context. and a measure of her historical significance. You wouldn't expect to come to a lecture on Callaghan, Europe and the World, for instance, or probably Major, Europe and the World. You might come to a lecture on Blair, Europe and the World. He's probably the only other modern leader who matches her in international impact. And I suppose that, in the last resort, is the measure for her importance and even her greatness. So, what about the possibility that she changed things for the better? Well, simply by behaving as she did, by being assertive rather than conciliatory, she did help to restore national self-confidence. The mood changed from the apologetic, helpless tone of much of 1970s foreign policy. The government, too, did enjoy simply more successes than its predecessors. A very early and big success over Zimbabwe in 1979. The Falklands was a major victory for Thatcher. And the more I read Charles Moore's biography, the more I realise how outstanding her leadership was, actually, although she'd made so many blunders in the run-ups to the Argentine invasion. She did get our money back from Europe. We still have it, a lot of it. She did a deal over Hong Kong, much against her instincts, but that deal did eventually stick. Like de Gaulle, I think the 20th century figure with whom she can best be compared, she refused to accept that the current Cold War confrontation was fixed for eternity. She looked beyond it and offered an alternative vision of a post-Cold War order sustained by liberal great powers acting in accordance with national interests. Now, that vision, of course, has not been fully realised in the years since she left office, but we are now living, whether we like it or not, in a multipolar, not a bipolar world. A world in which vast numbers of people enjoy far greater freedom and prosperity than in the Cold War era. And even in its present economic difficulties, the United Kingdom has not reverted to the pessimism of the 1970s. I think we do need to give Thatcher credit for these changes. What about the argument, though, that nothing much changed? Or at least not in the way that Mrs. Thatcher wanted or expected. As George Walden pointed out, when she left office in 1990, the broad outlines of British foreign policy remained exactly as they'd been when she assumed it. Membership of NATO, of the European Community, and incidentally the Commonwealth. And if the Soviet Union was no longer there, contrary to widespread supposition, it was not due to her alone. You could make this point even further in a way, and point out that in the 1980s, Britain became a more open and more internationally integrated society than ever before. Don't forget the abolition of exchange controls very early in Thatcher's premiership, which exposed Britain to the full force of the international economy in ways that no government since the First World War would have dared contemplate. And Britain, of course, became increasingly integrated in Europe throughout the 1980s. By 1987, one contemporary wrote, Britain was more completely a European community power than ever before. Britain moved from awkward outsider in 1979 to an established and important member of the European community. Or to take one other example of giving up or sharing powers, the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. No other government, no previous government would have allowed another government to interfere in British domestic affairs in this way. So now we move to the sort of final section, really, and that is the suggestion that she changed things for the worse. And of course, Thatcher's many critics have many variations on this theme. The title of my lecture actually is adapted from a very good book called Britain, Europe and the World by Bernard Porter, who Martin knows well. He was my head of department. I took over from him actually in 1999. That's how I was able to appoint Martin. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. Bernard was a very good historian, is still a very good historian. This book, Britain, Europe and the World, was published in 1983, a second edition in 1986, and it's very much a product of those early Thatcher years, and it's a highly effective critique in many ways. Looking back to British foreign policy from the mid-19th century onwards, Thatcher seemed to Porter to have retained Britain's 19th century economic liberalism, the belief in free trade and unfettered capitalism, but to have abandoned its political liberalism. The great libertarian power of the 19th century had become closed, repressive, and this was largely due to Thatcher, above all in domestic policy. Or to take another variant, Simon Jenkins, an outstanding journalist, as you probably know, in Thatcher and Sons, published a few years ago, tracing the continuity from Thatcher to Major to Blair and Brown, argues that it was the Falklands venture in 1982 that led to the reversal of planned defence cuts, especially in the Navy, and ironically allowed the creation of an out-of-area capability that made possible later adventures in Iraq, Afghanistan and elsewhere. If we'd had those cuts in the early 80s as Mrs. Thatcher planned and tried to force through, we would not be able to operate outside Europe today. And I've been trying to reflect on that development and developing a sort of theory which you may or may not want to take up. And that is that Thatcher, in this sense, deflected Britain from the path of normality or adjustment to reality on which it had been set by successive decisions by Labour and Conservative governments in the 1960s and 70s. Withdrawal from east of Suez, entry into the European Economic Community, the strategic withdrawal from post-imperial commitments, including Rhodesia, all of these were in train before Thatcher. And the decisions taken early in her premiership were consistent with this path. Lancaster House was very much in line with the sort of things that David Owen had been trying to do as Foreign Secretary. Siding with Europe against the United States over the Russian pipeline was the sort of thing that would have greatly appealed to Ted Heath, I should think, if Mrs. Thatcher hadn't been doing it. Even getting my money back from Europe, as she famously demanded, was merely unfinished business from an unsatisfactory mid-70s fudge. The then Foreign Secretary, David Owen, believed that he had set in train a sensible strategy for reducing Britain's budget contribution in 1977, only for it to be abandoned when the Conservatives came to power in 1979. And this is corroborated by one senior Foreign Office official who recalled that Britain's contribution was not on Margaret Thatcher's agenda when she came to power, and that she had to be briefed about it. So I suppose what I'm trying to do is rehabilitate the 1970s. This is perhaps a forlorn cause. But one could say that they administered economic crisis and social and political crisis, administered the kind of jolt that war, defeat and occupation had delivered to countries like Germany, France or Japan. And at that point, we had the opportunity, if we chose, to accept our position as a middle-ranking and not very ambitious European power. What we did instead was to divert the fruits of economic recovery and North Sea oil into high defence spending and overseas adventures. The Blair years saw a revival of Thatcherite pretensions in foreign policy, with interventionism and the special relationship carried to even more extreme lengths. It is true, of course, that Blair tried to forge a different relationship with Europe, but as we know, that early promise was not sustained. And then I suppose one might see Gordon Brown as representing another part of the Thatcherite legacy, the hostility to the euro, though of course it was mainly hostility to Tony Blair in his case. Well, that leads me back finally to Europe, and perhaps I haven't said all that much about Europe in this lecture, but this does seem to be the most fatal missed opportunity of the Thatcher years, because it was something she could possibly have done differently. Sir Julian Bullard, at that time ambassador in Bonn, summed up the problem in October 1987. Here we have, he wrote, a Prime Minister in her 9th year in office with vast international experience, including more than 25 European summits, presiding over a country whose economy, largely thanks to her, is turning out enviable statistics. You would think, wouldn't you, that in these circumstances Britain would be giving the lead in Europe and the continentals would be following it. But is this happening? I think not. Why not? Because we don't seem to be interested in any particular objective except the internal market in which Smarties can be sold in the same packet from Copenhagen to Constantia. What I think is missing, vision. Margaret Thatcher could have articulated an alternative vision. She nearly did so in her notorious Bruges speech in 1988. That speech, if read properly, offered a far wider and more generous perspective on Europe than the one being promoted by the Brussels centralisers. It was the famous part of her lecture where she spoke of looking on Warsaw, Prague and Budapest as great European cities and reminding her audience that we must never forget that east of the Iron Curtain, people who once enjoyed a full share of European culture, freedom and identity have been cut off from their roots. We take it for granted now. People did not take it for granted in 1988. That vision was obscured. Instead, she allowed Bernard Ingham to spin another part of the speech to the British press as the only one that really mattered. The one about not rolling back the frontiers of the state in Britain only to see them reimposed by a European superstate. Why did this happen? I think Thatcher was unable to give a clear lead on Europe, actually in either direction, because she never fully made up her mind about it. A deep-seated scepticism on the one hand was combined with a curiously fatalistic acceptance on the other hand of successive stages of integration from the Single European Act to the European monetary system, along with a growing sense of resentment each time she gave way. And it was combined too, especially after 1987, with a very deliberate adoption of the anti-European cause as a way to revive conservative electoral fortunes. Out of office, she had no further qualms and led the opposition to the Maastricht Treaty that inflicted such damage on her own party in the 1990s and has returned with a vengeance in the present decade, as we all know. I suppose one could say that Thatcher's problem, and it was one shared by her successors, was that her dogmatism was confronted with an even more powerful dogmatism on the part of Delors, Mitterrand and Kohl. Now we can see that that was Europe's problem too. Well, that was going to be the end of my lecture, but I didn't want to end on such a pessimistic note. And a happy thought occurred to me as I sat in the Eurostar comfortably riding between London and Brussels. I couldn't have done that without Margaret Thatcher, because it was, of course, Margaret Thatcher who was responsible for the decision to build the Channel Tunnel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for a fascinating and very rich and fine-grained lecture. I think there is a lot in this presentation that we can discuss, from the Eurostar and very present memories to the 1970s, the early stages of her biography. And I would just like to give the floor to you, to the first question. I would like to start.
Well, I have two questions. I start with one, and then we see. When I heard you talking about Margaret Thatcher, and particularly her relationship to the Foreign Office, I to what extent she's a constructed figure, because it seems as if so much importance given to her as a person, as a leader, but then on the other hand, apparently her advisors played a really important role in making her, well, take the right decisions. So I was wondering, is that a contradiction in itself, or is it just the way she's being presented and she's being constructed maybe in politics?
I think probably the latter, in the sense that it's a deliberate construction, and it's very much her construction. She always had a prejudice against the Foreign Office. She always would say it represents the foreigners, not the British people, this sort of thing. In a way, she believed that. I mean, she did feel that, and she was often very scornful of Foreign Office. And sometimes she was right to be scornful. Foreign Office's conduct of the Falkland question before the Argentine invasion, it was pretty feeble, actually. On the other hand, she, as I've suggested already, she did have a great deal of respect for the diplomats that she met and worked with. So as soon as they became acceptable, they're somehow no longer Foreign Office, I think. She had this mental shift. A good example would be Anthony Parsons, who was then our ambassador at the UN, who was absolutely crucial in turning around the UN in favour of Great Britain at the time of the Argentine invasion. It could have gone very differently if he'd asked the UN to, say, support the British position in the Falklands rather than simply condemn Argentine aggression. Condemning aggression is a much easier thing to get a resolution on, and she never forgot that. She was always grateful to him. She thought Nicholas Henderson was great. You know, he was the ambassador who really defended the British position in the United States during the Falklands War. She had a great respect for all the Foreign Office officials who worked for her in Downing Street. And above all, she had respect for Charles Powell, who in a way transformed himself from a Foreign Office person into a Thatcher person and never looked back. And he became almost more royalist than the Queen, if you like, always articulating an anti-Foreign Office view. So there are elements of, as you say, on both sides. It's a myth she liked to create. She was sometimes critical of Foreign Office, but she often had a great deal of respect for individual diplomats.
Are there other questions before you, or do you want to continue with the second question right away? Whatever. Right, yeah.
The second is maybe a little bit more difficult because I'm quite interested in this relationship of Thatcher to Europe. And besides the example you gave, what was the alternative vision that she could have offered?
Well, I suppose what I'm talking about is widening rather than deepening. And of course, in practice, most of the European leaders she was dealing with were not that interested in widening Europe. They were mostly keen on deepening it. I think if she could have if she could have put the extension of the European community eastward in a more positive context, and not simply spoken about trade and single market and that sort of thing. That was the aspect she liked. What she didn't like was deeper integration. I'm just speculating, really. It might have been. I increasingly feel, on the one hand, she missed an opportunity. Secondly, as I was sort of hinting at the end of my lecture, I feel that the leaders of Europe at that time, continental Europe, the European Commission, France and Germany above all, were so determined on a certain path, which ultimately led to the creation of the euro, that actually Britain was not in a position to counter that. I've always wished, for instance, that Britain could have established much more constructive relations with the smaller European countries, which were often of a similar mind. Scandinavian countries, for instance, the Netherlands probably. But for some reason, Britain never managed to create that. Or could they have created a closer relationship with Germany? There's a constant theme in the 80s, the Foreign Office trying to build up a good bilateral relationship with Germany to counteract the Franco-German axis, and somehow not quite getting there. Partly because there wasn't much interest on the British side, partly because actually Genscher wasn't that interested either. But the potential seemed to be there. One thing I would say, actually, if I'm going on this theme, one thing this government has done is actually forge much more constructive relationships with the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries, for instance. They have an annual forum now in which they all meet. There's a much greater sense that Britain has a lot to learn from those societies than there was ever the case in the 80s. So I think, and also there's a much greater stress within current foreign policy, I think, on the bilateral relationship with Germany and with France. Bilateralism, in a way, is the way in which Britain now seeks to exert influence.
Excellent. Other questions? Yes, please.
I happened to be in Great Britain when when Thatcher died. Now, I was struck by the fact how much the debate about her legacy immediately became part of present-day political debate. And I wonder how you see your own role as a historian in these debates. Can you sort of inform these debates historically, or do you want to?
That's a slightly leading question. I think as an official historian, I don't see it as my role to lead debate. I do see it as my role to inform debate. But also as a historian, I'm tending to look backwards. So the stuff I'm working on is primarily at the moment on the 1980s, just because that's the area we're working in. If the stuff we produce has an influence, well, that's great. But as you know, it's very difficult to quantify the influence of any historical product, whether it's a monograph or a volume of documents, on current thinking. I mean, I would say, I think, that the volume of documents we published a few years ago on Britain and German unification did nuance the debate. The one that the caricature that I was describing here isn't quite as popular now. People now see that Britain did play a more constructive role, and certainly, we worked very closely with the German embassy in promoting that volume when it came out. The German government, I think, was quite happy with it. Our embassy in Berlin was happy with it. So, in these very small ways, we are contributing perhaps to a more nuanced view of the past. What it does for the present, I don't know.
If I I may ask a follow-up question. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'll wait.
Because it's a follow-up, maybe just now. I also happened to be in England when Margaret Thatcher passed away, and I was also surprised about the level and the intensity and the contestedness. How this really kind of the old conflicts came up again.
Yeah.
Again, many of them, of course, centering more around her domestic policies than the foreign policy. And again, I think the lecture has shown to us that also in the foreign policies, there was a lot of ambivalence of success and failure. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on why there is this difference. Of course, there is standard explanation that domestic policies is what people care more about. But I also wonder, and this maybe takes us back to the first question, if this is also because she was more successful in really fashioning herself as a successful leader at the international level, where again, as you've also demonstrated, there is also failure and ambivalence next to successes.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm just reminded to say Gorbachev has a much better image outside of Russia than in Russia. Thatcher is rather similar, a very powerful image in the United States, for instance, and in Eastern Europe today, Central and Eastern Europe. I was actually also surprised by the divisiveness of the response to her death. Much as I disliked Thatcher as a domestic phenomenon, I mean, I lived in the northeast of England throughout the Thatcher years, and I saw that, the damage it inflicted. I was surprised in a way that those emotions are still there, and also that they're espoused mainly by young people, which made me think actually they probably don't know very much, and they're just spouting sort of cliches that they've inherited from somebody else. That was part of my answer. Have I answered?
I think,
I might come back to a bit more.
I have two different questions. First about Thatcher and European integration and Germany. I was wondering, I mean, Thatcher was against too much European integration, and she was also afraid of German reunification because she was fearing that reunified Germany would then dominate the European Union, and if that got more integrated, then Germany's power over the whole continent would expand. This is a bit of a hen and egg question, but I wonder what was first, or was it both? So was she afraid of European integration because of Germany, or was she afraid of German reunification?
That's exactly what you're getting.
Europe.
It's a really difficult, interesting question, really. I think I would say there's sort of two parallel things. Mm-hmm. One is her hostility to Germany, which is not a very sophisticated one. It's based on her schoolgirl upbringing, the fact that she grew up in the times of Nazi persecution, that they actually had Jewish refugees in their home for a short time, and also her father and the lessons of Munich. Although her father actually supported Munich, that's not always known, but he did. And that's on the one hand, and then the other is this, which I think produces a fairly simple and simplistic view of Germany. Germany is inherently aggressive. We can't allow it to get to a situation where it can dominate again. We've learned the lesson of two world wars. That's simple. On Europe, I think she's actually much more ambivalent, because if you go back to her public pronouncement, especially in the 1960s, she's pretty standard Tory line on Europe. Nothing very, 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 very positive at that time. And if you look at her in the referendum debates at 75, again, she's on the side of the yes vote instead of staying in. I think it's very difficult to pin down. She fluctuated more on Europe than she did on Germany. She acquired anti-European, new elements of anti-Europeanism entered into it. For instance, when I quoted the thing about not really knowing much or thinking about the European rebate question before she came into power, that's true. But then it became a dominant theme. You know what I mean? She was. I'm jumping about a bit, but it's a sort of response to your question as well. It's going back to what I was saying, really. She's not a consistent thinker. She is one who predominantly reacts all the way through, and new sensations, new ideas come, and she adopts them with great vigour. And she's not always conscious that she's contradicting herself. And it's the vigour and it's the moving forward, going back to the very first point I was making, that is typical of the way she operated. I would strongly recommend that you read the first few pages of Charles Moore's biography, where he's describing how he came to write it, and how strange it was very easy to write it, because she didn't have a view on her. In a way, she didn't have a view on her own place in history, apart from a very simple one. She wasn't bothered about the detail of her past. Whereas any other British politician would be determined at every single thing that he'd written at a certain date was correct, and you have a consistent line. I mean, you think of almost all politicians are like that. She was very unusual in that respect. And it was this sort of work ethic, which was in a way a substitute for consistent thought,
Right.
which is both a strength and a weakness. Thank you.
Could I follow up? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
What's another?
Yes, in the wake of the upset, the prospect of deepening political integration is causing in the Conservative Party within England at the minute. Do you think that Margaret Thatcher would have entertained the idea of talking to Brussels about a repatriation of powers, which is what David Cameron is doing at the minute, or do you think she would have opted more for a complete departure from the European Union?
That's a very good question, difficult question to answer. I think my answer would be, if she'd been in government, she'd have been talking like Cameron. If she was in opposition or out of power, she'd been talking like the anti-Europeanists. Partly because she was a much more cautious politician than she's often given credit for. And she was very good at not taking unnecessary risks, actually. And if she could see the dangerous consequences of trying to renegotiate aspects of the relationship, for instance, she might well have been restrained, as she was so often restrained before, by her officials. You know, you can't really push for this much. It's much better to go along with Europe. Out of office, after she lost power, she lost all restraint on Europe. And she put herself at the forefront of the anti-Maastricht movement within the Conservative Party. As I've said, that was enormously damaging, and people now, you know, pro-Europeans, looking back on that, really regard that as a sort of betrayal. You know, that she, again, she could have behaved differently. She could have been supportive. I mean, Edward Heath treated her very badly when he was ousted. She treated Major very badly when she was ousted. Sometimes you want politicians to behave a little bit better, but I'm afraid that's usually too much to expect. Emotions, understandably, come to the fore. So I've sort of answered a question now, but it's a difficult one to pin down because we don't actually know what she would have done in the situation we're in now, which is rather different from the one she faced when she was Prime Minister.
Just a very helpful question following on from what you said, which is I wonder also whether her attitude became hardened after office, partly perhaps because she lacked the advisory and support structures of Whitehall and of the Foreign Office. That's the first point, really. The second point was also, you mentioned about myths, and it's a very persistent myth, certainly people of her generation, about foreigners generally and Germans in particular. And yet, in many other areas of her time as a politician, she responded well to confrontation and argument. Parsons, indeed, you know, answered her back when he was at the UN, and she thereafter appointed him a main advisor. So there's the myth making, and yet there's the sense that she wants to be, you know, deal with rational people who can argue against her. But perhaps this is a case of hubris over time, becoming less and less aware of these things. And the last point, just to finish on, is just on the point of legacy, which is the Conservative Party today and the youngsters. And when you were mentioning about the debate after her death, the Conservative Party in Parliament, very many younger politicians are all Thatcherite in their attitudes towards Europe and towards foreigners.
Yes, because as we were talking before, actually, they are a product of the Thatcher years. What you're saying about advice, I think, is very, very interesting. She was most successful when she had good advisors. And they're often, across the board, you can think William Whitelaw, Ian Gower, her personal private secretary, was very, very loyal to her. Of course, moved on to other things and wasn't her PPS for very long. Whitelaw resigned. So by the mid-80s, she was not getting that sort of candid advice at her shoulder. Margaret, you know, do you really think we should do that? That sort of, there was nobody to hold her back. The other thing was, and I think Charles Moore makes this point, she strangely enough relied much more on civil service advice than you might think. She didn't really rely all that much on the sort of private coterie of special advisors that many subsequent politicians have done. Blair, probably, people like that. So she was very old-fashioned and very correct, actually, in her view of the civil service. And although we have this sort of, we've talked about already the way in which she got fed up with the Foreign Office, right across the board, she kept the systems working properly. She didn't do going for sofa government. She had proper committees, and she took proper advice. The trouble was that some of those civil servants then became, as it were, unofficial or too close to her. Now, Charles Pole is perhaps the obvious example. I then had another question.
Two questions actually. One about they are short ones, but one about the continuity question, because I was quite intrigued by what you said about certain points of continuity between the 70s and the 80s. I would be interested in Thatcher's fear of Germany. Do you think that's a Thatcher thing, or do you think it's a British thing? And the other thing, it's very unlike me to ask a question like this, but I can't help it. I sometimes wonder if I look at the extent of hatred that you can see, I mean, towards Thatcher, even today, or especially today, I sometimes wonder if it has something to do with her being a woman, that maybe people expected, you know, first woman prime minister to be some sort of caring mummy figure, and instead you get this really tough cookie who refuses to, who maybe flirts with other politicians, but who is tough and focused on economic recovery.
I'll take that question first. Yes, I think there is something in that. The funny thing was, she was quite, she very much emphasised her conventionality as a woman as well. That she was always a housewife. She always cooked Dennis's breakfast every morning. She was very keen. She constantly proclaimed housewifely virtues as the way to run the economy. You know, any housewife knows that you can't spend more than you've got. You know, that's the sort of classic thing. So there is that. I mean, one's getting into sort of all sort of stereotypes and so on, but she was a pretty old-fashioned looking woman right through her career, but especially actually earlier in her career. If you look at the way she dressed in the 50s and 60s, those terrible hats, you know, and she was, I don't know how to put this really, but she was unusually old-fashioned by comparison with British society in the 60s, for heaven's sake. She looked much older often than she actually was. Did people want women to behave more like women should behave and not like she behaved? I'm not quite sure about that. I think people did accepted that she was who she was, and if she hadn't got that sort of personality, she would not have got to the top. Compare with other successful or less successful women politicians. The obvious parallel is with Barbara Castle. You know, she was outstanding other woman. And Castle, actually, if you read her diaries, was the one British politician who really understood Margaret Thatcher in a way and admired her. And she's really well dressed, she's really stylish, and she's jolly well giving the men what they deserve. This sort of thing. So Barbara Castle saw her as a sort of kindred spirit. And I think if Castle had got to the top, she would have operated in some ways rather similarly. Or take another prominent woman, Shirley Williams. Well, you can see why Shirley Williams didn't get to the top. She wasn't like Margaret Thatcher or like Barbara Castle. I mean, she was a nice woman, but you know, she was not. Well, actually, she was not of the people. I think that's the difference. I mean, Thatcher had her feet on the ground. She came from very humble surroundings. She didn't like them. She tried to get away from them, but she knew what real life was like. So did Barbara Castle. Shirley Williams had a much more cushioned upbringing. Are there other women politicians one could compare them? You know, it's disappointing that there have not been many stronger women politicians in the 2 decades or so since 1990. Your other point was, did the British share Thatcher's hostility towards Germany? I think it's a very difficult question. If you look at the opinion polls in 1989-90, most British people thought German unification was a jolly good thing. You know, 70%. And among younger people, the proportion was even greater. Again, you see, I think these things go in waves. I think the British became more anti-German under the influence of a very, very malignant press in the 80s and 90s. I don't think in the 50s and 60s there was quite as much hostility towards Germany than there was later. These things can be stoked up, can be exploited. I think the other point about Germany is there's a huge amount of ignorance about Germany. Hardly anybody goes there for holidays. You know, you just have you don't have an image of Germany, perhaps, of what Germany is really like in Britain, in the same way as you perhaps do of France or Spain. So my answer, I'm afraid, is a fence-sitting one. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no.
Thanks.
Yeah, you've had access to this treasure trove of primary documents, and you talked earlier about certain violence to her annotations and marginalia, or some of it. And I wondered just if you can recall things you were particularly surprised or shocked by, that you stumbled upon.
President von Weizsäcker, typical German nationalist. You know, that sort of. There's a lot of. Actually, if you read if you read our volume of documents, I carefully placed all her comments in footnotes. It's a very dry process of editing, but in fact, all the entertainment is in the footnotes. So you should actually read them. There's lots of extra. Or put it another way, there's very little sustained writing on Margaret Thatcher's part. She hardly ever wrote anything at length. There's only one example of her writing anything of more than a few pages, and that was about a year after the Falklands conflict, where she did actually sit down to write her recollections of it in a very, kind of the right word, not a very sophisticated way. I mean, her style was not at all stylish or anything like that. The only place I found a longer expression of her views, again I printed this in the volume, is when Charles Pohl was saying to Mrs. Thatcher, okay, you're going to have these German historians here to talk about Germany. What do you really want them to talk about? I've got some ideas here, but tell me what you want. And she actually then annotated his document with, for her, quite long minutes, a couple of sentences. And I printed them, and there are things like, you know, we must never forget that, you know, the spirit of people's spirits cannot be suppressed. Ultimately, you know, people rise up against oppression. And she's talking more about Eastern Europe than Germany there, but you get glimpses there of a more sustained philosophy. But she wasn't a systematic thinker or writer, I think.
Yes, please.
Good evening. I would like to ask you more about her neoliberal legacy, and if this neoliberalism, like thinking, somehow influenced the relationship towards the European community. And I mean, the single market would definitely mean, like, would suit the neoliberal perception.
I think the quick answer is yes. It did strongly influence. I think what one would have to do is work out what her successors in government did and how they operated. And in some ways, I think neoliberalism, you know, took off even more strongly after her leaving office. Privatisation, for instance, went in new directions. Rail privatisation happened in the early 90s under Major, for instance. I sometimes think that the present government is more Thatcherite than Thatcher ever was. I mean, she would never touch the post office, for instance, but that is clearly going to be privatised very soon. This government in domestic policy is much more radical in many ways than she ever was. What effect that has on the relationship with Europe, I'm not sure, except that it seems to... There were phases when, of course, we were much less neoliberal. I mean, you know, the Blair years, there was a long period when Labour was in power, when it wasn't ostensibly promoting neoliberalism to the same degree as Thatcher, although again, in practice it probably was fairly close. I'm unable to come up with a clear answer really, except that I suppose the British mentality, the British approach to economics is much closer to the American one than the continental European one. And also the approach to social policy. So those things together have made British policy very sceptical towards much of what Europe has been trying to do in the last 30, 40 years actually. And I don't think that's going to change. So Thatcher didn't start that, she reinforced it. But I think it's an underlying British trait which has made us very awkward customers, very awkward partners, I think, for a very long time.
Yes, please.
We've spoken a lot about Margaret Thatcher's relationships outside of the United Kingdom. Could you perhaps touch more on her relationships with Northern Ireland and Scotland, especially in the wake of possible Scottish independence? How does she stand in relation to Scotland?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. Northern Ireland is, as usual, very, very difficult. She was strongly hostile to all aspects of IRA terrorism. She had no sympathy at all for the hunger strikers. Remember, she allowed them to kill themselves. She was not going to compromise. It was when she was challenged, really, by those sorts of things. She would not give way. I don't know enough really to know what she thought of Ulster Unionism. I mean, the Unionists were supposed to be very close to the Conservatives, yet they're also extremely awkward partners. I imagine she just wanted a deal by which somehow the Irish question could be sorted, and even bringing the Irish government into that was part of the deal. I don't know enough about Northern Ireland. I'll have to come back to that one perhaps. Scotland, I think, is an interesting one because Scotland was you know, in many ways a conservative stronghold as much as a Labour one in the 80s. You could say that Thatcher single-handedly destroyed the Conservative position in Scotland, and she did it through a thing we haven't talked about but ought to talk about, and that's the poll tax, which was, you know, the underlying obsession for Thatcher from very early in her upbringing, really. I mean, this whole, you know, her father was a local councillor, so the financing of local government was an issue she was always familiar with, and she always felt that you somehow had to deal with the iniquity of a little old lady in a big house paying as much as a large family, all those sorts of simple things. But the solution she came up with was a total disaster, as probably everybody knows, and it seemed it was completely iniquitous. And then they made the mistake of experimenting in Scotland first before the rest of the United Kingdom, and that really, I think, destroyed the Conservative position in Scotland. It didn't yet open up the way to Scottish nationalism, but it obviously benefited the Labour Party in the first instance. But then when Labour unleashed the floodgates, or however one calls it, by giving Scotland autonomy, a certain degree of self-government, that of course gave the nationalists their opportunity. So I think both Labour and the Conservatives in different ways have contributed to the weakening of the United Kingdom. That comes back to the point you were making at the beginning, really. What the ultimate outcome will be, I don't know. You know, a referendum on Scottish independence will take place pretty soon. I think it probably won't go in the direction of independence, but it could. And certainly Scotland has become far more detached, and I would say far more parochial in recent years. Maybe Scottish people like that, but I mean, it's when you go to Edinburgh now, the mood strikes me as different. They're not really interested in what's happening in the rest of the United Kingdom.
Any other questions at this point? Don't see any. I think then it's time to really thank our speaker for an excellent speech and also for your willingness to answer all these questions that took us to all possible facets almost of Margaret Thatcher, both at the domestic level and also, of course, at the international, European and global level. So thank you very much again for a very rich and very interesting, fascinating lecture. I'd also like to thank Martin Farr again for the introduction and for the cooperation, and also Helene von Bismarck, who had the idea of kind of creating this cooperation. Thanks a lot. The good news is that we have taped this lecture, so those who weren't able to attend tonight will have a chance to see this, I think, online, both on the website of the Society as well as of Vasos. Again, many thanks for being here with us tonight, and enjoy the rest of the evening, I think, without you.